Eleanor McCarthy had always been an early riser, a habit formed during 40 years of marriage to Patrick, who left for union jobs before dawn. Now, at 68, she still woke at 5:30, though the house no longer held the purposeful, quiet of a working man's morning routine. Instead, it carried the muffled sounds of a family that had settled into rhythms that didn't quite include her. Footsteps overhead, water running through pipes, voices that seemed to float around her, rather than toward her. She moved through her kitchen with the measured precision of someone who had prepared thousands of breakfasts in this same space. The countertops bore the scars of decades of family meals, but they were clean, orderly, maintained with the care of someone who understood that a home required tending. The morning light filtered through curtains she'd sewn herself in 1987, casting familiar shadows across linoleum Patrick had installed with his own hands the year before Sophia was born. The coffee pot gurgled to life, and Ellie reached automatically for the cabinet where Patrick's favorite mug had lived for 37 years. Her fingers closed around empty air. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. She paused, hand suspended in the space where the chipped blue ceramic should have been, the one with "World's Greatest Dad" in faded gold letters that the children had given him for Father's Day in 2003. She opened the cabinet fully, moving, aside the newer mugs Jessica had purchased, sleek white ones that matched the dinnerware she'd gradually introduced to replace Ellie's everyday set. Nothing. A systematic search of the other cabinets yielded nothing. The dishwasher held only the previous night's dinner dishes, none of them Patrick's mug. Ellie's stomach tightened as she opened the garbage can and peered inside. There, beneath yesterday's coffee grounds and the remains of Sophia's art project, lay the broken pieces of blue ceramic. "Morning, Grandma." Danny's voice startled her, and she quickly closed the garbage can lid, forcing a smile for her 6-year-old grandson as he padded into the kitchen in his Batman pajamas. "Morning, sweetheart. Did you sleep well?" Danny nodded, climbing onto one of the kitchen stools. "Mom said you might make pancakes today." "Did she now?" Ellie reached for the pancake mix, though Jessica had never actually asked her to make. Breakfast. It was simply assumed now, another item on the unspoken list of services Ellie provided in her own home. "Well, then I suppose I'd better get started." The kitchen filled with the sounds of morning preparation, the whisk against the bowl, the gentle sizzle of butter in the pan, Danny's chatter about his upcoming spelling test. Ellie listened with genuine interest, storing away details about his day that she would remember long after his parents had forgotten them. This was her gift and her burden. She paid attention in a world that had grown increasingly distracted. "Danny, are you ready for—" "Oh." Jessica appeared in the doorway, her expression shifting when she saw Ellie at the stove. She wore the navy suit she'd purchased for job interviews 6 months ago, though the interviews had stopped coming. Her dark hair was pulled back in a style that belonged in a boardroom rather than a kitchen, and her makeup was applied with the precision of someone who had once needed to look professional every day. "I was going to make him cereal," Jessica said, her tone carrying the slight edge it acquired whenever she found Ellie doing something she'd planned to do herself. "The pancakes are almost ready," Ellie replied evenly, flipping a golden circle in the pan. "Danny, would you like to go wake your sister?" As Danny scampered upstairs, Jessica moved to the coffee pot, pouring herself a cup into one of her white mugs. "We really should establish more routine around breakfast," she said, not quite looking at Ellie. "The children need consistency." Ellie nodded, though she wasn't certain what could be more consistent than pancakes every Tuesday for the past 2 years. "I found Patrick's mug in the garbage," she said quietly. Jessica's hand stilled on the coffee cup handle. "It was broken. I didn't think you'd want to keep broken dishes around." "I would have liked to decide that myself." "Ellie, it was just a mug, and honestly, we have plenty of others." Jessica's voice carried the brisk efficiency she'd once used in conference rooms, the tone of someone accustomed to making decisions and moving on. "We can't keep every old thing just because it has sentimental value." The pancake on the griddle began to burn around the edges, but Ellie didn't flip it immediately. She stood very still, considering Jessica's words. "We," "our house," language that had gradually shifted over 3 years, pronouns that revealed assumptions about ownership and authority. "Of course," Ellie said finally, sliding the slightly burnt pancake onto a plate. "You're probably right." Sophia appeared in the doorway, 8 years old and observant in the way that made adults uncomfortable. She looked between her grandmother and mother with the serious expression she'd worn more frequently in recent months, as if she were trying to solve a puzzle whose pieces kept changing shape. "Are you fighting again?" Sophia asked. "We're not fighting, sweetheart," Jessica said quickly, moving to smooth her daughter's sleep-tangled hair. "Grandma and I were just discussing breakfast." Sophia accepted this explanation with the polite skepticism of a child who had learned to navigate adult euphemisms. She climbed onto the stool beside Danny, who was already drowning his pancakes in syrup. The morning routine proceeded with the orchestrated chaos of a family preparing for the day. Jessica packed lunches with military efficiency, barking instructions about homework and permission slips while simultaneously checking her phone for job prospects that seemed to materialize less frequently with each passing week. Ellie moved around the edges of this activity, refilling juice cups and wiping syrup spills, a supporting player in a drama where she had once been the director. "Sophia, your math folder is on the counter," Jessica called out, then turned to Ellie with barely concealed irritation. "Could you please move? I need to get to the sink." Ellie stepped aside, watching as Jessica washed the mixing bowl she'd used for pancakes. It was a small thing, washing a bowl, but it carried weight in the ecosystem of small gestures that had evolved in this house. Jessica washed dishes now as if she were cleaning up after a guest who had overstayed their welcome. Mickey appeared in the kitchen doorway, already dressed in his work clothes, jeans and a flannel shirt that carried the permanent scent of sawdust and coffee. At 36, he retained the lean build of someone who worked with his hands, though there were new lines around his eyes that spoke to the stress of unemployment and the delicate balance he tried to maintain between the two women, who anchored his world. "Morning, Ma," he said, kissing Ellie's cheek with the automatic affection of habit. He moved to Jessica, kissing her forehead while she finished packing lunches. "You're up early." "Same time as always," Jessica replied, though this wasn't quite true. She'd been rising earlier lately, as if trying to stay ahead of something that might catch up to her if she moved too slowly. Mickey poured coffee into a travel mug, the kind with the construction company logo that marked him as someone who had once held a position of authority on job sites. He surveyed the kitchen scene, his wife's efficient preparations, his children eating breakfast, his mother cleaning the griddle, and seemed to find nothing amiss in the choreography of their morning. "Don't wait up tonight," he said. "We're trying to finish the Brookline job this week." He kissed both women goodbye with the same casual affection, a gesture that had once felt natural but now seemed to highlight the delicate balance he was trying to maintain. Mickey had always been the family peacekeeper, the one who smoothed over conflicts with jokes and diversions. But lately his efforts felt more desperate, as if he sensed something building that his usual methods couldn't diffuse. The children grabbed their backpacks and kissed Ellie goodbye, their small arms wrapping around her waist with the unconscious affection that made every morning worth the small humiliations that had preceded it. Jessica gathered her purse and car keys, moving with the purposeful energy of someone who had important places to be, though Ellie knew she was only driving to the coffee shop where she would spend 2 hours applying for jobs online. "I'll pick up groceries after my appointments," Jessica said, already mentally organizing her day. "We're running low on everything." Ellie nodded, though she had already planned to stop at Star Market after her own errands. Jessica's version of grocery shopping involved expensive organic items and brand names that reflected aspirations rather than budgets. But pointing this out would only create the kind of conversation that Mickey would somehow be expected to resolve when he came home exhausted from 10 hours of physical labor. The front door closed with a finality that seemed to echo through the house. Ellie stood in her kitchen, surrounded by the detritus of a family morning, sticky plates, scattered newspapers, the lingering scent of coffee and pancake batter. She had orchestrated this routine for 3 years, and before that, she had orchestrated different versions of it for decades. The rhythm was as familiar as breathing, yet something fundamental had shifted in recent months. She walked to the front window and watched Jessica's car disappear around the corner, then returned to the kitchen to finish cleaning up. As she loaded the dishwasher, she noticed that one of the white mugs had a small chip on the handle. Jessica would undoubtedly throw it away without consulting anyone, another small decision that would be made unilaterally in what had once been Ellie's domain. The silence that settled over the house felt different from the peaceful quiet she had once treasured. This was the silence of displacement, of being present but not included, of occupying space without claiming it. She moved through rooms that still contained her furniture, her photographs, her lifetime of accumulated possessions, but the arrangement of these things had subtly changed over 3 years. A lamp moved to accommodate Jessica's reading chair. Family photos repositioned to make room for Jessica's decorative items. Patrick's recliner pushed against the wall to create more space for the children's toys. None of these changes had been dramatic enough to protest in the moment. Each adjustment had been presented as practical, temporary, considerate of everyone's needs. But the cumulative effect was that Ellie felt like a guest in her own home, politely accommodating the preferences of people who had somehow assumed authority over spaces she had created and maintained for 40 years. She settled into Patrick's chair, one of the few items that Jessica hadn't suggested relocating, and reached for the phone on the side table. The business card had been tucked inside her address book for 2 weeks, ever since her conversation with Margaret O'Sullivan about property rights and family obligations. Margaret's cousin had faced a similar situation with her son's family, and the resolution had required legal intervention. The lawyer's receptionist answered on the second ring, her voice professionally warm. "Donnelly and Associates." "Yes," Ellie said, her voice steadier than she felt. "I'd like to schedule a consultation about tenant rights and eviction procedures." As she made the appointment, Ellie's gaze moved to the mantelpiece where Patrick's photograph sat among family pictures that Jessica had gradually rearranged. His face wore the gentle smile she remembered from their last good years together, before the illness that had taken him slowly and the grief that had left her vulnerable to well-meaning family members who somehow began making decisions for her rather than with her. "What would you do, Patrick?" she asked silently, though she already knew the answer. Patrick had never tolerated disrespect from supervisors or family members alike. He had possessed the rare gift of setting boundaries without cruelty, of commanding respect through quiet strength rather than raised voices. The appointment was scheduled for Friday morning. Ellie hung up the phone and sat quietly in the chair that still held the shape of her husband's body, surrounded by the accumulated weight of 3 years' worth of small compromises and overlooked slights. She thought about Patrick's mug, broken, and discarded without ceremony, and realized it wasn't really about the mug at all. It was about the assumption that her feelings didn't require consultation, that her possessions could be managed by someone else's judgment, that her role in this house had diminished to that of an unpaid caretaker whose opinions were inconvenient, rather than valuable. The phone rang again, startling her from her thoughts. Margaret's voice carried the familiar warmth of 30 years of friendship. "Ellie, dear, I wanted to confirm you're coming to the barbecue Saturday. I'm making your favorite potato salad." Ellie smiled genuinely for the first time that morning. "Of course, Maggie. We'll all be there." "Wonderful. It's been too long since we've had a proper neighborhood gathering. Everyone's looking forward to catching up." After hanging up, Ellie remained in Patrick's chair, considering the weekend ahead. Margaret's annual barbecue was a South Boston tradition, a celebration of community and continuity that brought together families who had weathered decades of change together. It would be the perfect setting for what Ellie was beginning to recognize as an inevitable reckoning. She thought about the lawyer's appointment, about the legal documents that would soon be in her possession, about the conversation she would eventually need to have with Mickey and Jessica. The weight of what she was contemplating settled around her like a familiar shawl, heavy but not uncomfortable, the burden of someone who had finally decided to reclaim what had always been rightfully hers. The morning sun climbed higher, filling the kitchen with the golden light that had graced thousands of family breakfasts in this house. But today, for the first time in 3 years, Ellie McCarthy sat in her own home and began planning to take it back. 3 days later, Ellie sat in the waiting room of Donnelly and Associates, her hands folded carefully over the leather purse that had been Patrick's last Christmas gift to her. The office smelled of coffee and leather-bound law books, a comforting scent that reminded her of her father's study when she was a child. James Donnelly had handled Patrick's estate planning and the legal complexities that had followed his death, and his gentle manner had made him someone Ellie trusted with the most difficult decisions of her widowhood. "Mrs. McCarthy?" The receptionist's voice drew her from her thoughts. "Mr. Donnelly will see you now." The lawyer's office was lined with photographs spanning 40 years of Boston legal practice, Donnelly with mayors and union leaders, at ribbon cuttings and community events. He was a man who understood the neighborhoods he served, the pride and stubbornness that drove people to seek legal remedies for problems that might otherwise destroy families. "Ellie," he said warmly, rising from behind his desk. "It's good to see you, though I wish it were under happier circumstances." She had explained the situation over the phone, but sitting across from him now, she found herself revisiting the details with the careful precision of someone who had rehearsed. Her grievances, the pattern of disrespect, the assumption of authority in her own home, the gradual erosion of her position from homeowner to unwelcome guest. "I understand your frustration," Donnelly said when she finished. "But I want to make sure you've considered all the implications. This is your son we're talking about." "That's exactly why I'm here," Ellie replied. "Because he's my son, and I raised him to show respect. If I don't demand it now, what am I teaching my grandchildren about how families should treat each other?" Donnelly studied her face, recognizing the determined set of her jaw that he remembered from their meetings after Patrick's death, when she had insisted on understanding every detail of her financial situation rather than simply accepting his advice. "The law is clear," he said finally. "As the property owner, you have the right to terminate their tenancy with proper notice. 30 days is standard." The document he prepared was surprisingly simple for something that would fundamentally alter 3 lives. Ellie read each line carefully, her mind drifting to another piece of paper she had signed in this same office, Patrick's will, which had left everything to her with the understanding that she would care for their children, as she saw fit. Patrick had trusted her judgment then. She hoped he would trust it now. That evening, she sat at her kitchen table with a photo album spread before her, pages documenting the early years of Jessica and Mickey's marriage. There was Jessica at their wedding reception, radiant in white silk, embracing Ellie with genuine warmth and calling her the mother I always wanted. There was Mickey, proud and protective, his arm around his new wife as they posed in front of the brownstone that would become their first home. The photographs told the story of a young couple grateful for family support during lean times. Jessica's thank you note after their honeymoon, written in careful script on expensive stationery. "Dear Mom McCarthy, I can never thank you enough for welcoming me into your family and your beautiful home. I promise to take care of it as if it were my own." The note was tucked between pages of pictures from Sophia's birth, when Jessica had wept with gratitude at having a grandmother who could help with night feedings and laundry during those overwhelming first weeks. When had gratitude become assumption? When had taking care of it as if it were my own become taking care of it as my own? Ellie couldn't pinpoint the exact moment when the dynamic had shifted, but she could trace its progression through small incidents that had seemed insignificant at the time. The first time Jessica had rearranged furniture without asking, explaining it was more functional for the children. The gradual replacement of Ellie's everyday dishes with Jessica's wedding china, making family dinners feel formal and tentative. The way Jessica had begun answering the door when neighbors came by, as if she were the hostess welcoming guests to her home. Most painful was the memory of last Christmas morning, when Sophia had referred to the brownstone as our house. In front of the assembled family, Mickey had laughed, ruffling his daughter's hair with pride at her sense of belonging. Jessica had smiled with satisfaction. Only Ellie had noticed the subtle but significant shift in pronouns, the way her granddaughter's language reflected the reality that had evolved under their roof. She closed the photo album and reached for Patrick's portrait on the kitchen counter, studying his familiar features. "I miss your voice," she whispered to the glass. "I miss having someone who understood why small things matter." Patrick had possessed an intuitive understanding of respect that had shaped their marriage and their children's upbringing. He never would have tolerated the casual dismissal of someone's feelings, even in service of efficiency or practicality. He had taught their children that courtesy was not optional, that gratitude was not a burden, and that family bonds required tending like any other relationship worth preserving. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. The eviction notice lay folded in her purse, ready for the moment when diplomacy would give way to legal necessity. Ellie understood the weight of what she was contemplating, the shock it would cause, the family relationships it might permanently alter, the community discussion it would inevitably generate. But she also understood that some lines, once crossed, required clear consequences. She thought about Saturday's barbecue, about the neighbors who would gather in Maggie's backyard to celebrate another summer in the community they had helped build and sustain. These were people who had raised children together, weathered economic hardships together, buried spouses and parents together. They understood the unspoken rules that governed family relationships, the balance between generosity and respect, that kept households functioning across generations. Many of them had faced similar challenges with adult children who had returned home during difficult times. Some had found ways to establish boundaries that preserved dignity on all sides. Others had watched their good intentions twisted into resentment and entitlement. Ellie suspected that her situation was not unique, but she also knew that public resolution would carry more weight than private confrontation. The phone rang, breaking her reverie. Mickey's voice carried the exhaustion of a long day on a construction site. "Hey, Ma. Just wanted to let you know I'll be late again tomorrow. This Brookline job is kicking our asses." "I'll keep dinner warm," she said automatically, though Jessica had been cooking dinner most nights lately, another assumption of household authority that had evolved without discussion. "You're the best, Ma. I don't know what we'd do without you." The words that had once brought comfort now carried an edge of irony. What would you do without me? She wondered. You'd figure it out, like adults do. But she said only, "Drive safely, sweetheart. I love you." After hanging up, Ellie returned to Patrick's photograph, tracing the familiar lines of his face with her finger. Tomorrow she would go grocery shopping, choosing ingredients for the potato salad she would bring to Maggie's barbecue. She would select Jessica's favorite dessert, a small gesture of consideration that she hoped would be remembered when harder truths emerged. The weekend would bring resolution, one way or another. The eviction notice would serve its purpose as catalyst, forcing conversations that had been avoided for too long. And perhaps, in the aftermath of honest confrontation, they would find their way back to the mutual respect that had once made their shared life possible. Ellie folded the photo album closed and placed Patrick's portrait back on the mantelpiece, where it belonged. In 48 hours, she would discover whether love was strong enough to survive the demand for dignity, or whether some wounds cut too deep for forgiveness to bridge. Saturday morning arrived with the kind of perfect August weather that made Boston neighborhoods come alive. Clear skies, gentle breeze, temperature hovering in the comfortable 70s that would make Maggie's backyard barbecue ideal. Ellie woke to sunlight streaming through her bedroom windows and the sound of Jessica's voice drifting up from the kitchen, unusually animated for someone who typically moved through mornings with quiet efficiency. "Mickey, can you reach the good serving bowl? The blue one on the top shelf?" Jessica's tone carried a lightness that had been absent from recent weeks, the kind of anticipatory pleasure that came with social gatherings and temporary escape from household tensions. Ellie lay still for a moment, listening to the domestic sounds below, Mickey's deeper voice responding with good humor, the children chattering excitedly about seeing their neighborhood friends, the clatter of dishes being arranged for transport. It was the sound of a family preparing for a pleasant day together, and for a moment, Ellie felt the familiar tug of affection that made confrontation seem unnecessarily harsh. She rose and dressed carefully, choosing the navy dress with small, white flowers that Patrick had always said brought out her eyes. The eviction notice rested in her purse like a loaded weapon, its formal language waiting to detonate the carefully constructed peace that currently prevailed in her home. Downstairs, she found the kitchen transformed into a staging area for the barbecue. Jessica moved between counters with the kind of organized energy she had once brought to work projects, her cheeks flushed with the pleasure of having a social event to plan and coordinate. She wore a yellow sundress that made her look younger, more like the grateful daughter-in-law from the wedding photographs than the sharp-tongued woman who had thrown away Patrick's mug 3 days earlier. "Morning, Grandma?" Sophia bounded into the kitchen wearing her favorite dress, the pink one with tiny roses that Ellie had bought for her last birthday. "Mom says there's going to be a bounce house at Mrs. O'Sullivan's. Is that so?" Ellie smiled, accepting the enthusiastic hug that reminded her why family bonds were worth fighting to preserve. "You'll have to be careful not to get that pretty dress dirty." Danny appeared moments later, struggling with the buttons on his polo shirt. Without thinking, Ellie knelt to help him, her fingers working automatically through the task she had performed for 3 generations of McCarthy children. "There you go, handsome," she said, smoothing his collar. "You look very grown up." Jessica paused in her preparations, watching the interaction with an expression that was difficult to read. For a moment, something soft crossed her features, perhaps recognition of the countless small services Ellie provided, or memory of her own gratitude during the early years when such help had felt like salvation rather than interference. "Ellie," Jessica said, her voice carrying unfamiliar warmth, "thank you for helping with the kids. I know I don't say it enough, but—" She trailed off, as if the words required more vulnerability than she was prepared to offer in front of the children. Mickey appeared in the doorway, carrying the cooler they would use to transport drinks to the barbecue. "Look at this beautiful family," he said with genuine pride, surveying his wife, children, and mother arranged in the kitchen. "Maggie's going to think we actually have our act together." He kissed Jessica's cheek, then moved to Ellie for their customary morning embrace. For a moment, the kitchen held the warmth of genuine family affection, the kind of easy closeness that had once characterized their shared life before pride and assumption had poisoned the well of goodwill. "What can I carry?" Ellie asked, gesturing toward the array of covered dishes Jessica had prepared. "Oh, you don't need to worry about anything," Jessica replied quickly. "Mickey and I can handle the heavy stuff. Maybe just bring your purse and we'll be all set." The words were meant kindly, but they carried the familiar undertone of management that had become Jessica's default mode with Ellie. Even acts of consideration felt like dismissal, suggestions that Ellie's contributions were unnecessary rather than appreciated. The family set out together for the 3-block walk to Maggie's house, presenting the picture of domestic harmony that Ellie knew their neighbors expected to see. Mickey carried the cooler while Jessica managed the children's excitement about the party ahead. Ellie walked slightly behind, her purse secure over her shoulder, its contents known only to her. The neighborhood showed signs of Saturday afternoon preparation, lawns being mowed, children playing in yards, the general air of weekend leisure that marked summer in South Boston. Mrs. Kowalski waved from her front porch, where she was arranging flowers in pots that had graced her steps for 30 years. The Sullivans were loading their car for what looked like a beach trip, their teenagers moving with the practiced efficiency of a family accustomed to weekend adventures. "Beautiful day for a party," called out Tom Chen from across the street, where he was washing his car in the driveway. "Maggie must have special connections with the weather service." The easy neighborhood banter reminded Ellie why she loved this community, why she had chosen to remain here after Patrick's death rather than moving to one of the senior communities that several of her friends had selected. These were people who had watched her children grow up, who had brought casseroles during Patrick's illness, who understood the unspoken bonds that held Boston neighborhoods together across decades of change. Maggie's backyard was already alive with activity when they arrived. Red, white, and blue bunting draped the fence, and folding tables groaned under the weight of potluck contributions. Children ran between clusters of adults, their voices mixing with the sounds of classic rock playing from speakers that Maggie's son had set up near the back deck. "The McCarthy clan arrives!" Maggie's voice carried across the yard as she approached with arms outstretched. She embraced each family member in turn, her genuine warmth making everyone feel like honored guests rather than neighborhood obligations. "Jessica, that potato salad looks magnificent," Maggie continued, directing them toward the food table. "And Ellie, I see you brought your famous chocolate cake. The O'Brien grandchildren have been asking about it since last year." The afternoon unfolded with the comfortable rhythm of a neighborhood tradition. Adults clustered in conversational groups while children monopolized the bounce house and lawn games. Jessica seemed to bloom in the social environment, her sharp edges softened by wine and genuine laughter as she connected with other mothers about school concerns and summer vacation plans. Mickey found his place among the men gathered around the grill, their conversation ranging from Red Sox prospects to construction work availability. He looked relaxed in a way that had become rare at home, his natural sociability restored by the absence of household tension. Ellie moved through the gathering with the practiced grace of someone who had attended decades of such events. She listened to concerns about neighborhood development, shared updates about her grandchildren's activities, and accepted compliments on her cake with the modest pleasure of someone whose contributions were genuinely valued. For nearly 2 hours, the family existed in a bubble of harmony that made Ellie question the necessity of the confrontation she had planned. Jessica had been almost affectionate during their preparations. Mickey was relaxed and attentive, and the children were happily absorbed in play with their friends. Perhaps the tensions that loomed so large in her daily experience were smaller in the context of broader family life. But as the afternoon progressed and Jessica's wine consumption increased, familiar patterns began to reassert themselves. Comments that began as social pleasantries gradually acquired sharper edges. Observations about traditional families and old-fashioned expectations that seemed directed at conversations Ellie was having with other elderly neighbors. The eviction notice remained in her purse, waiting for the moment when patience would give way to principle, when the careful peace of the afternoon would shatter under the weight of words that could never be taken back. As the sun began its descent toward evening, Ellie found herself standing at the edge of the gathering, watching her family interact with their community, knowing that in a matter of minutes or hours, everything would change forever. The moment arrived with the casual cruelty that marks life's most devastating turning points. Not with dramatic buildup, but with the simple convergence of wine, wounded pride, and an audience that would make retreat impossible. Ellie stood near the dessert table, accepting compliments on her chocolate cake from Rita Flanagan, whose own mother had lived with Rita's family for 15 years before passing peacefully in her sleep. "You're so lucky to have such a wonderful family," Rita was saying, her voice carrying the wistful tone of someone who understood the blessing of harmonious multi-generational living. Jessica seems like such a devoted daughter-in-law. From across the yard, Jessica's laughter carried a sharp edge that made Ellie turn. Her daughter-in-law stood in a circle of younger mothers, her cheeks flushed with wine and social confidence, gesturing animatedly as she held court. The conversation seemed to center on children and schools, the comfortable territory of suburban motherhood that Jessica navigated with practiced ease. "Oh, absolutely," came Jessica's voice, pitched just loud enough to carry beyond her immediate audience. Though I have to say, some of the older generation has very different ideas about how families should work. They expect so much deference, Like we should be grateful for every little thing. Ellie's conversation with Rita faltered as the words registered. Rita's eyes widened slightly, her gaze moving between Ellie and Jessica with the uncomfortable awareness of someone witnessing family discord in public. "I mean," Jessica continued, emboldened by the attention and the wine, "there's this whole attitude that we should just accept whatever arrangements they think work best. No consideration for what the younger generation might want or need." Margaret O'Sullivan appeared at Ellie's elbow, her face tight with the kind of controlled anger that Irish women perfected over generations of managing family crises. "Is she talking about what I think she's talking about?" Maggie murmured, her voice low but audible to the small group that had gathered around the dessert table. Jessica's voice rose another notch, her inhibitions clearly diminished by 2 glasses of wine and the validation of her audience. "And honestly, sometimes I think they create problems just to stay relevant, like they need to feel important, so they make everything more complicated than it needs to be." The backyard had grown quieter as conversations paused and attention shifted toward Jessica's increasingly pointed commentary. Mickey stood frozen near the grill, his face pale as he recognized the dangerous territory his wife was entering. The children continued playing, oblivious to the adult drama unfolding around them. "Jessica," Mickey called out, his voice carrying a warning note that only made his wife's spine stiffen with defiance. "What?" Jessica turned toward him, her chin raised in challenge. "I'm just having a conversation with my friends about family dynamics. Is that not allowed anymore?" Dorothy Chen, one of the mothers in Jessica's circle, looked deeply uncomfortable. "Maybe we should talk about something else," she suggested quietly, but Jessica waved off the suggestion with the dismissive gesture of someone beyond diplomatic intervention. "No, I think this is important," Jessica declared, her voice now carrying clearly across the entire gathering. "We live in a society where adult children are expected to sacrifice their own autonomy just because their parents think they know best. Where we're supposed to be grateful for being treated like children. In our own homes." Ellie felt the weight of 30 neighborhood gazes settling on her, the uncomfortable attention of people who had witnessed something that should have remained private. Rita Flanagan's hand found her arm in a gesture of support, while Maggie's face darkened with the righteous anger of someone watching a fundamental breach of community values. "Eleanor," came Jessica's voice, finally addressing her directly, "I'm sure you have thoughts on this topic." The challenge in Jessica's tone was unmistakable, the wine-fueled confidence of someone who believed she held the moral high ground. Around them, the party had effectively stopped as neighbors found themselves unwilling witnesses to a family confrontation none of them had wanted to observe. Ellie looked at her daughter-in-law, flushed with wine and self-righteousness, surrounded by other mothers who were beginning to step back as they recognized the dangerous ground Jessica had chosen to occupy. She thought of Patrick's broken mug, of 3 years of accumulated slights, of the gradual erosion of respect that had brought them to this moment. "You're absolutely right, Jessica," Ellie said quietly, her voice carrying with crystal clarity across the suddenly silent backyard. "This is an important conversation about family dynamics and gratitude." She reached into her purse with movements so deliberate that everyone present understood they were witnessing something significant. The white envelope emerged slowly, its official appearance unmistakable even from a distance. "You see," Ellie continued, unfolding the document with theatrical precision. I've been thinking quite a lot about autonomy and living arrangements lately. About what it means to be grateful, and what it means to be treated with respect in one's own home. Jessica's face began to change as she registered the formal nature of the paper in Ellie's hands, the wine-induced confidence wavering as sobriety crashed over her like cold water. This is a 30-day notice to quit and vacate the premises, Ellie read aloud, her voice steady and clear. Addressed to Jessica Torres McCarthy, Michael McCarthy, Sophia McCarthy, and Daniel McCarthy, regarding the property located at 47 Dorchester Street, South Boston, Massachusetts. The silence that followed was absolute. Even the children's voices had stopped as the playground games paused, young minds sensing the sudden shift in adult energy even if they couldn't understand its source. You have 30 days from today's date, Ellie continued, to remove yourselves and your belongings from my property. This notice is being served in accordance with Massachusetts General Laws, Chapter 186, Section 12. Jessica's mouth opened and closed without sound, her face cycling through shock, disbelief, and dawning horror as she realized the magnitude of what had just occurred. The public nature of the humiliation was complete, served in front of neighbors, friends, and community members who would remember this moment for years to come. Mickey stood paralyzed near the grill, caught between his wife's public mortification and his mother's devastating response, unable to move toward either woman without choosing sides in a conflict that had just escalated beyond any possibility of private resolution. The eviction notice fluttered slightly in the evening breeze as Ellie folded it carefully and returned it to her purse. Around them, 30 neighbors stood in stunned silence, witnesses to the kind of family destruction that would become neighborhood legend, the day Eleanor McCarthy served her own son with eviction papers at Margaret O'Sullivan's annual barbecue. I believe, Ellie said quietly, her voice carrying to every corner of the yard, that covers the topic of family dynamics quite thoroughly. The chocolate cake sat forgotten on the dessert table as Ellie turned and walked toward the gate, leaving behind her family, her community, and the comfortable fiction that some words could ever be taken back. The walk home stretched 3 blocks that felt like 3 miles, each footstep echoing against the sidewalk with the weight of irreversible decision. Behind her, Ellie could hear the subdued voices of her family beginning to follow, but she didn't turn around. The evening air carried the sounds of a neighborhood barbecue winding down, children being called inside, conversations resuming in hushed tones, the careful distance that good neighbors maintained when witnessing family tragedy. By the time she reached her front door, her hands were trembling slightly as she worked the key in the lock. The adrenaline that had carried her through the confrontation was beginning to ebb, leaving behind the stark reality of what she had just done. She had publicly humiliated her son's family. She had turned a community gathering into the setting for family destruction. She had crossed a line that existed in bold, permanent ink. The front door closed behind her with a soft click that seemed to seal her inside her own decision. The house felt different already, not just quiet, but charged with the electricity of impending change. In 30 minutes, Mickey and Jessica would walk through this same door, and nothing would ever be the same between them. Ellie moved through her living room, her fingers trailing along familiar surfaces. The back of Patrick's chair, the mantelpiece where family photographs smiled with the innocent joy of better times, the coffee table where Jessica's magazines lay scattered with their articles about home organization and family harmony. Everything looked exactly as it had this morning, but the context had shifted so fundamentally that the space felt like a museum of her former life. She was standing in the kitchen when she heard the front door open. The silence that followed was more deafening than shouting would have been. No rushed footsteps, no urgent voices, just the careful movement of people who were afraid to make sudden sounds in a house that had become a minefield. Mickey appeared in the kitchen doorway, first his face gray with shock and something that might have been disappointment. Behind him, Jessica moved like someone walking through a nightmare, Her yellow sundress wrinkled and her earlier confidence completely evaporated. The children flanked their parents, Sophia's eyes wide with confusion, while Danny pressed close, to his father's leg. "Ma," Mickey began, his voice hoarse. "What just happened back there?" The question hung in the air between them, loaded with 3 years of accumulated tension and 30 years of mother-son relationship that had suddenly become unrecognizable. Ellie looked at her son, this man she had raised, whose scraped knees she had bandaged, whose dreams she had encouraged, whose family she had supported through their darkest financial struggles. "What happened," Ellie said quietly, "is that I finally responded to being called a burden in front of my entire neighborhood." Jessica's face crumpled. "I didn't. I wasn't talking about you specifically. I was making general observations." About what?" Ellie's voice sharpened. "About ungrateful older people who expect deference. About family members who make things complicated just to feel important. You were 20 feet away from me, Jessica. Everyone at that party knew exactly who you were talking about." "Mom, please." Mickey stepped forward, his hands raised in the universal gesture of someone trying to prevent further damage. "Can we just take a breath here? Can we talk about this like adults?" "Adults," Ellie repeated, the word carrying bitter weight. "Adults don't throw away other people's possessions without asking. Adults don't rearrange furniture in homes they don't own. Adults don't refer to other people's houses as ours when they're living there rent-free." The accusations spilled out with 3 years of suppressed force, each one landing like a physical blow. Jessica's face cycled through emotions, shock giving way to defensiveness, defensiveness crumbling into something that looked like genuine remorse. "I never meant..." Jessica's voice broke. "I've been grateful. You know I've been grateful." "Have you?" Ellie's question was soft but devastating. "When was the last time you thanked me for anything? When was the last time you asked before changing something in my home? When was the last time you treated me like the homeowner, rather than the hired help?" Sophia tugged on Mickey's shirt. "Daddy, why is everyone upset? Are we in trouble?" The innocent question from an 8-year-old cut through the adult rage, like a knife, reminding everyone present that their conflict had consequences beyond their own wounded feelings. Mickey lifted his daughter, his face struggling with the weight of explaining the unexplainable. "No, sweetheart. The grown-ups just need to work some things out." "But Grandma seems really mad," Danny observed with the brutal honesty of a 6-year-old. "Are we going to have to move away?" The practical question from a child's perspective forced the adults to confront the reality they had been avoiding. The eviction notice wasn't just symbolic gesture, it was a legal document with real consequences. In 30 days, these children might be changing schools, leaving friends, adapting to a new home because of words spoken in anger and pride too wounded to bend. Jessica sank into one of the kitchen chairs, her face in her hands. "This can't be happening. This can't be real." "It's very real," Ellie said, though her voice had lost some of its earlier steel. Watching Jessica's breakdown, seeing the children's confusion, observing Mickey's desperate attempts to hold his family together, the full weight of her decision was beginning to settle around her like a heavy coat. "You can't just kick us out," Jessica said, looking up with red-rimmed eyes. "We have rights. We've lived here for 3 years. This is Danny and Sophia's home." "It's my home," Ellie replied quietly. "It's been my home for 43 years, and according to Massachusetts law, you're tenants at will. I can terminate your tenancy with 30 days' notice, which I've just provided." Mickey set Sophia down and moved closer to his mother, his voice dropping to the pleading tone he'd used as a child when trying to negotiate his way out of trouble. "Ma, come on. You can't really mean this. We're family." "Family," Ellie echoed. "Yes, Mickey, we are family, which is exactly why I expect to be treated with respect in my own home. Which is why I shouldn't have to listen to my daughter-in-law call me a burden in front of people I've known for 30 years. The kitchen fell silent except for the hum of the refrigerator and the distant sounds of normal Saturday evening. Life continuing in houses where families weren't imploding. Through the window, Ellie could see the Kowalskis' porch light coming on, the Chen family returning from their beach trip, the ordinary rhythm of neighborhood life that her own family had just spectacularly disrupted. "What do you want from us?" Jessica asked finally, her voice small and defeated. "What can we do to fix this?" It was the first time in 3 years that Jessica had asked what Ellie wanted rather than assuming she knew what was best. The question hung in the air, heavy with possibility and the faint hope that some bridges might still be capable of repair. But Ellie looked around her kitchen, at the family she loved, at the life they had built together, at the wreckage of trust that lay scattered around them like broken glass, and realized that she didn't yet know the answer to Jessica's question. Some damage, once done, required more than apologies to heal. Some words, once spoken, changed the fundamental nature of relationships. And some decisions, once made in the heat of wounded pride, had to be lived with regardless of the regret that followed. The eviction notice sat in her purse like a ticking bomb, counting down 30 days to a future none of them could yet envision. Sunday morning found Ellie kneeling in the familiar wooden pew at St. Bridget's, where 3 generations of McCarthys had sought guidance during times of crisis. The church held the scent of incense and old wood, the accumulated prayers of decades woven into its very foundations. She had come early, before the 10 o'clock Mass, seeking the quiet sanctuary that only empty churches could provide. Father Tom Brennan found her there, as she had hoped he would. At 58, he possessed the gentle wisdom of someone who had shepherded his flock through every conceivable family crisis, from wayward teenagers to bitter divorces, to the complex dynamics of multi-generational households under financial strain. "Eleanor," he said softly, sliding into the pew beside her, "I heard about yesterday." Of course he had. In a neighborhood like theirs, news traveled faster than Sunday morning coffee percolating through kitchen windows. By now, the story of the barbecue confrontation would have reached every household within a 6-block radius, probably with embellishments that made the drama even more spectacular than it had actually been. "I suppose I've given the parish something to talk about," Ellie murmured, her eyes fixed on the crucifix above the altar where she had been married, where her children had been baptized, where Patrick's funeral mass had been celebrated 5 years ago. "They're not talking with judgment," Father Tom assured her. "Most of the families here have faced similar struggles. The Morettis, the O'Briens, even the Chens dealt with his mother-in-law for 7 years before finding a resolution that honored everyone's dignity." Ellie turned to study his face, searching for signs of condemnation or disappointment. Instead, she found the patient understanding that had made him a trusted counselor to families navigating the treacherous waters of love, obligation, and wounded pride. "Tell me what happened," he said simply. The story spilled out in the quiet. Sanctuary, 3 years of gradual erosion, small slights that accumulated like snow until the weight became unbearable, the moment when private frustration exploded into public humiliation. Father Tom listened without interruption, his presence a reminder that even the most tangled family conflicts could be examined in the light of compassion and moral clarity. "Do you think I was wrong?" Ellie asked when she finished. Father Tom was quiet for a long moment, his hands folded in the contemplative posture she remembered from countless conversations during Patrick's illness. "I think you were hurt," he said finally. "And I think hurt people sometimes make decisions that serve justice rather than mercy." "Justice," Ellie repeated. "Is that what this is?" "You tell me. Do you feel justified?" The question cut deeper than she had expected. Sitting in the church where she had learned about forgiveness and turning the other cheek, Ellie found herself confronting the uncomfortable truth that justice and satisfaction were not always the same thing. "I feel..." She paused, searching for honesty. I feel like I finally stood up for myself. But I also feel like I might have destroyed my family. Those feelings can both be true, Father Tom said gently. The question now is what comes next. The eviction notice gives you 30 days to decide whether you want to be right or whether you want to be reconciled. Meanwhile, across the city in Roxbury, Jessica sat at her mother's kitchen table, her face streaked with tears and her hands wrapped around a cup of coffee that had grown cold while she recounted the previous day's disaster. Carmen Torres had listened to her daughter's story with the patient attention of someone who had raised 5 children through various crises, but her expression grew increasingly stern as the details emerged. "So let me understand this," Carmen said when Jessica finished. "You called this woman a burden in front of her neighbors at a party." "I didn't specifically say she was a burden," Jessica protested weakly. "I was making general observations about family dynamics and—" "Mija," Carmen's voice carried the sharp edge that had once silenced Jessica's teenage rebellion. "Don't insult my intelligence. You were talking about the woman who has let you live in her house for 3 years without paying rent. The woman who takes care of your children while you look for work. The woman who lost her husband and opened her home to her son's family because she loved them." Jessica's face crumpled. "You don't understand the situation, Mommy. She's been so controlling. She acts like we're guests in our own home." "It's not your home," Carmen said bluntly. "It's her home. She's letting you live there out of kindness, and you repay that kindness by complaining about her to strangers." The harsh truth hit Jessica like a slap. Carmen Torres had cleaned office buildings at night for 15 years to put her daughter through college, had sacrificed her own comfort to ensure Jessica's opportunities, had never once made her feel guilty for the help she provided. The contrast between her mother's generosity and her own ingratitude was suddenly, painfully clear. "I never asked to be in this situation," Jessica said, though the words sounded hollow even to her own ears. "I never wanted to be dependent on Michael's mother." "None of us ask for difficult situations," Carmen replied. "We ask for the strength to handle them with grace. Did you have grace yesterday, Jessica?" The question hung in the air of Carmen's small kitchen, where family photographs chronicled decades of struggle and achievement. Pictures of Jessica's graduation, her wedding, the grandchildren who brought light to Carmen's carefully budgeted life. Evidence of dreams realized through sacrifice and determination, and the reminder that dignity could be maintained even in the most challenging circumstances. "What am I supposed to do now?" Jessica asked, her voice small. "She served us with eviction papers in front of everyone." Carmen studied her daughter's face, seeing the frightened young woman beneath the defensive anger. "You could start by apologizing, really apologizing, not explaining or justifying, and then you could figure out how to show respect instead of just talking about it. It might be too late for that." "It's only too late if you decide it's too late," Carmen said firmly. "But first you need to understand something important. This isn't about who's right or wrong anymore. This is about whether you want to teach your children that pride is more important than family, or that families can work through difficult times if everyone is willing to swallow their pride and do better." Back at St. Brigid's, Ellie and Father Tom sat in comfortable silence as the morning sun streamed through stained glass windows, casting colored patterns across the worn wooden floors. The church was beginning to fill with early arrivals for the 10 o'clock Mass, families settling into their customary pews with the quiet efficiency of long-established routine. "What would Patrick do?" Ellie asked suddenly. Father Tom smiled, remembering the man who had been both a pillar of the parish and a devoted family man. "Patrick would probably remind you that being right and being wise are sometimes different things. He'd also tell you that the strongest people are often the ones who find ways to step back from the brink. Even when they've been humiliated, especially then," Father Tom said gently. "Anyone can hold a grudge, Eleanor. It takes real strength to create a path forward when everyone's pride is wounded. As the organ began to play the opening hymn, Ellie remained in her pew, wrestling with the choice between justice and mercy, between the satisfaction of being vindicated and the harder work of rebuilding trust. The eviction notice still had 29 days to run, 29 days to decide whether she wanted to be the grandmother who stood her ground or the one who found a way to bring her fractured family home. In Roxbury, Jessica sat in her mother's kitchen, confronting the uncomfortable truth that respect was earned through actions, not demanded through words. And in the house on Dorchester Street, Mickey and the children navigated the careful silence of a family, learning to live with the weight of things that could not be unsaid. The clock was ticking, but the final chapter remained unwritten. The knock on Ellie's front door came Tuesday afternoon, soft but persistent. Through the peephole, she saw a woman she recognized but had never spoken to directly. Carmen Torres, Jessica's mother, standing on the front steps with the careful posture of someone approaching a delicate mission. She wore a simple navy dress and carried a covered dish, her gray hair pulled back in a style that spoke to practical dignity rather than fashion. Ellie opened the door with curiosity, tempered by caution. In the 4 days since the barbecue incident, she had fielded calls from concerned neighbors, visits from well-meaning friends, and one awkward encounter with Mickey when he'd stopped by to pick up the children's school supplies. But Jessica's mother was an unexpected visitor. "Mrs. McCarthy," Carmen said, her accented English careful and formal. "I hope you don't mind my coming by. I brought flan. I thought maybe we could talk." The offering was unmistakably a peace gesture, the kind of diplomatic approach that mothers had been using to navigate family crises for generations. Ellie stepped aside to let her in, noting how Carmen's eyes moved appraisingly around the living room, not with judgment, but with the practiced assessment of someone who understood the weight of maintaining a home. "Please, sit," Ellie said, gesturing toward the sofa. "Can I make you coffee?" "That would be nice, thank you." They moved through the ritual of hospitality with the careful courtesy of two women who understood they were negotiating more than just a social visit. In the kitchen, Ellie prepared coffee while Carmen arranged her flan on one of the good plates, both of them buying time to consider their words. "You have a beautiful home," Carmen said when they were settled with their coffee cups. "I can see why my daughter loves living here." It was a masterful opening, acknowledging Ellie's ownership while recognizing Jessica's attachment to the space. Ellie studied Carmen's face, seeing intelligence and determination beneath the diplomatic approach. "Your daughter has made it clear that she has some issues with how I run my household," Ellie replied carefully. Carmen sighed, setting down her coffee cup with the decisive gesture of someone abandoning diplomacy for honesty. "My daughter is spoiled, not by money, we never had money, but by opportunity. She went to college, she married a good man, she had choices I never had. Sometimes having choices makes people forget to be grateful." The blunt assessment surprised Ellie. She had expected defensiveness, maternal protection, perhaps negotiation, on Jessica's behalf. Instead, Carmen was offering something more valuable: accountability. "I raised 5 children," Carmen continued. 3 sons, 2 daughters. They all lived with me at different times when life got hard. My oldest son brought his family back when he lost his job in 2008. My youngest daughter moved in when her husband died. Never once did any of them complain about my cooking, my rules, or my expectations. You know why? Ellie shook her head. Because they understood the difference between help and entitlement. They knew that gratitude is not just words, it's behavior. It's respect. It's understanding that when someone opens their home to you, you don't criticize how they arrange their furniture. The specific reference to furniture rearrangement made Ellie's eyebrows rise. Carmen noticed her reaction and nodded grimly. "Oh yes, she told me about moving your things around. She told me about throwing away your husband's mug. She told me about making rules for your own house. She told me all of this like she expected me to agree with her. And did you? Carmen's laugh was short and bitter. I told her she was acting like a spoiled child who doesn't understand the value of what she's been given. I told her that if someone had been as generous to me as you've been to her, I would kiss their feet every morning and thank God every night. The passion in Carmen's voice carried the weight of lived experience. Years of night shifts and sacrifice, of swallowing pride to provide opportunities for the next generation. Ellie felt something shift in her chest, a recognition of shared struggle across cultural lines. I worked cleaning offices for 15 years, Carmen continued. Came home at 6 in the morning, made breakfast for my children, slept for 3 hours, then got up to help with homework and make dinner. You know what I never did? I never complained about my situation to strangers. I never called my blessings burdens. You heard about what she said at the barbecue. The whole neighborhood heard. My friend Rosa lives 2 blocks from here. She called me Sunday morning to tell me what happened. She said she was embarrassed for Jessica, embarrassed for your family. The confirmation that the incident had traveled beyond South Boston made Ellie wince. Family conflicts that spilled into public view took on lives of their own, becoming cautionary tales that outlasted the original participants. I'm not proud of how I handled it, Ellie admitted. Serving eviction papers in public, that wasn't my finest moment. Carmen studied her with eyes that had seen enough family drama to recognize genuine remorse when it appeared. Maybe not. But sometimes people need shock to wake them up. Sometimes they need to see real consequences before they understand that their actions matter. They sat in silence for a moment. 2 mothers who had spent decades managing family crises, recognizing in each other the exhaustion that came with loving people who sometimes made destructive choices. Jessica called me crying yesterday, Carmen said finally. First time in 2 years she's asked for my advice instead of just telling me about her problems. She wants to know how to fix this. And what did you tell her? I told her that fixing requires admitting you broke something first. I told her that apologies without changed behavior are just noise. I told her that respect is earned through actions, not demanded through words. Ellie felt tears prick her eyes. After 4 days of neighbors' sympathy and Mickey's desperate attempts at mediation, here was someone who understood the fundamental issue, that love without respect was corrosive, that good intentions without consideration were ultimately destructive. The children, Ellie said softly. They're the ones who will really suffer if this can't be resolved. Carmen nodded gravely. Sophia drew me a picture yesterday. The whole family standing in front of a house, but everyone looked sad. When I asked her why they were sad, she said because Grandma was angry, and Mommy was crying, and Daddy looked worried all the time. The image of Sophia's drawing, innocent art documenting adult failure, hit Ellie harder than any lecture about forgiveness could have. These children had done nothing wrong, yet they were learning that families could shatter over words spoken in anger, that homes could be lost because adults couldn't find their way back to kindness. What do you think should happen? Ellie asked. Carmen was quiet for a long moment, considering her words with the care of someone who understood that advice given in family crises carried lasting weight. I think, she said finally, that you have already made your point. Jessica knows she was wrong. Mickey knows he should have spoken up sooner. The children know that disrespect has consequences. The question now is whether you want to be the grandmother who teaches them that mistakes are unforgivable, or the one who shows them that families can heal if everyone is willing to do better. And if Jessica isn't willing to do better? If this is just temporary remorse that disappears once the crisis passes? Carmen's smile was knowing. Then you use that eviction notice, but you give her the chance to prove she's learned something. First, you set conditions. You demand specific changes. You make it clear that respect is not optional in your house. As if summoned by their conversation, the sound of children's voices drifted from the street, Sophia and Danny walking home from school. their laughter mixing with the ordinary sounds of neighborhood life, continuing around the crisis that had consumed their family. Carmen stood, gathering her purse with the efficient movements of someone who had accomplished what she came to do. "I'll talk to Jessica. I'll help her understand what a real apology looks like, what changed behavior means. But the final decision is yours, Mrs. McCarthy. You're the one who has to live with whatever you choose." At the door, Carmen paused. "My grandmother used to say that the strongest women are the ones who know when to build walls and when to build bridges. You've built your wall. Jessica sees it now. The question is whether there's enough foundation left to support a bridge." After Carmen left, Ellie sat in her living room surrounded by the artifacts of family life, photographs on the mantelpiece, children's artwork on the refrigerator, the accumulated evidence of love that persisted even when respect had fractured. Outside, she could hear Mickey's truck pulling into the driveway, the sound of a family returning home to a house where the rules had changed, but the love remained. Complicated and conditional, but still present. 26 days remained on the eviction notice. 26 days to discover whether Carmen Torres was right about the possibility of building bridges, or whether some walls once erected were meant to stand forever. The parish house meeting room smelled of coffee and old wood, its walls lined with faded photographs of parish families spanning decades. Mickey had arranged the meeting after 3 sleepless nights and conversations with Father Tom that had left him understanding, finally, that avoiding conflict had only allowed it to fester into something potentially fatal to his family. They sat around a small table, Ellie on one side, Jessica and Mickey on the other, with Father Tom positioned where he could see everyone's faces. The arrangement felt formal, legal almost, like a mediation session where the stakes were measured, not in money but in the survival of relationships that had taken years to build and moments to damage. "Before we begin," Father Tom said, his voice carrying the gentle authority of someone who had shepherded families through their darkest moments, "I want to establish some ground rules. Each person will have the opportunity to speak without interruption. We're here to understand, not to debate. We're seeking truth, not victory." Jessica's hands were folded so tightly in her lap that her knuckles had gone white. She wore a simple black dress that made her look younger, more vulnerable than she had since the crisis began. Mickey sat rigid beside her, his face carrying the weight of a man who had finally accepted that peacekeeping and problem-solving were different skills entirely. "Eleanor," Father Tom said, "would you like to begin by sharing your perspective on what's led us to this point?" Ellie had rehearsed this moment in her mind for days, but sitting across from her son and daughter-in-law, she found herself abandoning prepared speeches in favor of raw honesty. "I want to start by saying that I love this family," she began, her voice steady but soft. "Everything I've done for the past 3 years has come from love. But love without respect becomes enabling, and I've enabled a situation that was slowly poisoning all of us." She paused, looking directly at Jessica. "I've enabled you to treat my home as if it were yours to manage. I've enabled Mickey to avoid difficult conversations by handling everything myself. I've enabled a dynamic where my feelings and preferences became less important than keeping the peace." Mickey shifted uncomfortably, recognizing himself in her words. Jessica's face had gone pale, but she maintained eye contact with Ellie, perhaps understanding for the first time that this conversation required her to listen rather than defend. "The morning you threw away Patrick's mug," Ellie continued, "I realized that somewhere along the way, I had become a guest in my own home. Not because you meant to make me feel that way, but because I had allowed small boundaries to be crossed until there were no boundaries left." Father Tom nodded gently. "Can you help us understand what respect looks like from your perspective?" "Respect," Ellie said, considering the word carefully, "is asking before you rearrange furniture that's been in place for decades. It's acknowledging that throwing away someone's possessions, even broken ones, isn't your decision to make. It's understanding that when someone provides housing, childcare, and financial support, Gratitude should be expressed through behavior, not just words. Jessica's composure finally cracked. I never meant to be disrespectful. I was trying to make the housework better for everyone. I was trying to contribute. Jessica, Father Tom said gently, this is Eleanor's time to speak. You'll have your turn. Ellie looked at her daughter-in-law with something approaching compassion. I know you didn't mean to hurt me, but impact matters as much as intention. And the impact of 3 years of small changes was that I felt displaced in the home where I'd lived for 43 years. When Ellie finished, Father Tom turned to Jessica. What would you like to share about your experience? Jessica took a shaky breath, her earlier defensiveness replaced by something that looked like genuine self-reflection. I've been angry for 3 years, she admitted. Angry about losing my job, angry about being financially dependent, angry about feeling like I was failing at everything I used to be good at. Her voice grew stronger as she found her footing. I moved into Eleanor's house feeling grateful and excited about being part of this family. But somewhere along the way, gratitude started feeling like debt, and debt started feeling like shame. Instead of dealing with my own feelings about our situation, I started resenting the reminder of our dependence. Mickey reached for her hand, and she didn't pull away. I think I started treating Eleanor like she was part of the problem instead of recognizing that she was the only reason we weren't homeless. Can you tell us about the barbecue? Father Tom prompted gently. Jessica's face flushed with embarrassment. I was drinking. I was feeling judged by the other mothers who all seemed to have their lives together. When people complimented our family situation, it made me feel defensive about being 34 years old and living with my mother-in-law. She looked directly at Ellie now, tears threatening. Instead of being proud of our family's support system, I felt ashamed of needing it, and when I feel ashamed, I get mean. I said things that were cruel and untrue because I was lashing out at my own situation. What specifically did you say that you regret? Father Tom asked. I called Eleanor a burden, Jessica said, the words emerging like a confession. I suggested that older people create problems to feel important. I essentially told 30 neighbors that my mother-in-law was a difficult person to live with, when the truth is that I've been difficult to live with. The admission hung in the air between them, finally spoken aloud in its full ugliness. Ellie felt some of the tension she'd been carrying for days ease slightly. Not forgiveness yet, but acknowledgement that the wound had been properly identified. Mickey, Father Tom said, what's your perspective on the family dynamics we've been discussing? Mickey looked miserable, but his voice was clear when he spoke. I've been a coward. I saw the tension building between the two most important women in my life, and instead of addressing it, I pretended it would resolve itself. He turned to his mother. Ma, I should have had conversations with Jessica about boundaries and respect. I should have established clear expectations about how we would function as a family under your roof. Instead, I let you handle everything and hoped the problems would disappear. And to Jessica? Father Tom prompted. Mickey faced his wife, his expression pained but honest. I should have helped you process your feelings about our situation instead of just hoping you'd feel better eventually. I should have reminded you regularly that living with my mother was a privilege, not a burden. I should have been the one setting expectations for how we treat the person who was saving our family. The room fell quiet as each person absorbed the weight of honest accountability. Father Tom let the silence extend, understanding that truth required time to settle into consciousness. Now, he said finally, we need to discuss what comes next. Eleanor, you've served an eviction notice with 21 days remaining. Jessica. And Mickey, you're facing the possibility of having to find new housing for your family. The question before us is whether this family crisis can become a family healing. Ellie looked around the table at the faces of people she loved, people who had just demonstrated more honest self-reflection than she'd witnessed in 3 years of living together. For the first time since the barbecue, she felt a flicker of hope that Carmen Torres might be right about building bridges. "I need to know," she said carefully, "that if we find a way forward, it will be based on genuine changed behavior, not just crisis-induced promises that will be forgotten once the immediate threat passes." "What would that look like?" Jessica asked, her voice small but determined. Ellie considered the question that would determine whether her family could heal or whether some wounds were simply too deep to bridge. Outside the parish house windows, ordinary life continued. Children walking home from school, neighbors tending gardens, the rhythm of community that her family had disrupted and might yet find a way to rejoin. The answer to Jessica's question would determine whether the next 21 days counted down to separation or toward the harder work of rebuilding trust on firmer foundations. The next morning, Ellie sat at her kitchen table with a legal pad and the weight of a family's future in her hands. Father Tom's words echoed in her mind. "The strongest people are often the ones who find ways to step back from the brink." But stepping back didn't mean stepping down. It meant finding a path that preserved dignity while creating space for redemption. She had spent the night thinking about Carmen Torres's advice, about the difference between walls and bridges, about what specific changes would be required to rebuild trust that had been systematically eroded over 3 years. The eviction notice sat beside her coffee cup, 20 days remaining on its countdown. But for the first time since the barbecue, alternative endings seemed possible. The list grew slowly, each item representing a boundary that had been crossed and would need to be reestablished. Household decisions require consultation with the homeowner. Furniture arrangements and decorative changes require permission. Personal belongings of deceased family members are off-limits without explicit consent. Contributions to household expenses will be established and maintained. Family meetings will be held monthly to address concerns before they escalate. Children will understand the hierarchy. "This is Grandma's house where we live gratefully." Mickey found her there when he came down for coffee, his face still carrying the exhaustion of honest self-examination. He read over her shoulder without comment, understanding that these weren't negotiable terms but foundational requirements for any future they might salvage. "Is this possible?" he asked quietly. "Can we really come back from what happened?" Ellie looked at her son, this man who had inherited Patrick's gentle nature but not his backbone, who had tried to keep peace by avoiding conflict until conflict became unavoidable. "That depends on whether you're all willing to do the work required." "Apologies are just words, Mickey. Changed behavior is what rebuilds trust." The sound of footsteps overhead announced that Jessica was awake, preparing for another day of job applications and the careful dance of living in a house where the rules had fundamentally shifted. In 18 hours since the mediation session, she had been almost formally polite, asking permission to use the washing machine, inquiring whether Ellie needed help with dinner, treating every interaction as if she were a guest rather than family. It was a start, but Ellie knew that crisis-induced courtesy could be as temporary as crisis-induced promises. The real test would come when the immediate threat passed, when old patterns reasserted themselves, when the daily irritations of shared living space began to accumulate again. Jessica appeared in the kitchen doorway, dressed for job interviews. In the navy suit that had become her uniform of hopeful professionalism, she looked younger somehow, as if the honesty of the previous day had stripped away years of defensive armor. "Good morning," she said carefully. "I made coffee upstairs. I hope that's all right." The small deference, asking permission for something she had done automatically for 3 years, illustrated how much the family dynamic had changed. Ellie gestured to the empty chair across from her, and Jessica sat with the cautious movements of someone still learning the new rules. "I've been thinking about what you asked yesterday," Ellie said, sliding the legal pad across the table. "About what changed behavior would look like." Jessica read the list slowly, her face cycling through emotions as each item registered. Some requirements were practical, financial contributions, consultation about household changes. Others cut deeper, acknowledging the psychological territory that had been contested for 3 years. "These seem fair," Jessica said finally, her voice small. "More than fair, actually. I should have been doing most of these things all along." "Should have doesn't help us now," Ellie replied, not unkindly. "The question is whether you can do them going forward, even when things get stressful, even when your pride feels wounded, even when old patterns try to reassert themselves." Jessica folded her hands in her lap, the gesture reminding Ellie of a child accepting responsibility for broken rules. "I found a job yesterday, part-time marketing position with a nonprofit in Cambridge. It's not what I used to do, and it pays less than half my old salary, but it's something." The news surprised Ellie. Jessica had been job hunting for months, with increasingly desperate focus, and the timing of this breakthrough felt almost providential. "That's wonderful news. Congratulations. It means I can start contributing to household expenses. Not much, but something. And it means I'll have somewhere to go during the day, somewhere to feel productive and useful again." Mickey looked between the two women, hope flickering across his features as he recognized the first genuine conversation they'd had in months. "Jess, that's great. When do you start?" "Monday, if—" She looked uncertainly at Ellie. "If we're still living here on Monday." The conditional nature of her statement highlighted the precarious position they all occupied. 20 days remained on the eviction notice, 20 days to prove that words spoken in mediation could translate into sustainable behavioral change. Ellie studied Jessica's face, searching for signs of the defensive anger that had characterized their relationship for months. Instead, she saw something that looked like genuine humility, the kind that emerged not from defeat, but from understanding. "There's something else," Jessica said, reaching into her purse. She withdrew a small wrapped package, placing it carefully on the table between them. "I know this doesn't fix anything, but I wanted you to have it." Ellie unwrapped the tissue paper to reveal a coffee mug, not identical to Patrick's broken one, but close. Blue ceramic with faded gold lettering that read, "World's Greatest Husband." The mug showed signs of age and wear, the kind of piece that had clearly been loved and used. "I found it at an antique shop in Harvard Square," Jessica explained, her voice barely above a whisper. "The dealer said it was from the 1980s, around the same vintage as the one that broke. I know it's not the same, but I thought maybe." Ellie turned the mug in her hands, feeling the slight chip on the handle that spoke to decades of morning coffee, the faded lettering. That suggested countless washings by someone who treasured it. It wasn't Patrick's mug. Nothing could replace that. But it was something more valuable. Evidence that Jessica understood the weight of what she had destroyed and had taken action to acknowledge that loss. "Thank you," Ellie said, her voice thick with unexpected emotion. "This means more than you know." The kitchen fell quiet except for the familiar sounds of morning, coffee percolating, the refrigerator humming, the distant voices of children getting ready for school upstairs. But the quality of the silence had changed from the careful tension of recent weeks to something that felt tentatively hopeful. "I want to try," Jessica said suddenly. "I want to prove that I can be the daughter-in-law you deserved from the beginning. I want my children to see that families can work through difficult times if everyone is willing to change." Mickey reached across the table to cover his wife's hand with his own. "We want to try, both of us. We know we've taken your generosity for granted, Ma. We know we've let you down." Ellie looked at the list of requirements, at the coffee mug. That represented acknowledgement of harm done, at the two people who had finally understood that love required respect to survive. The eviction notice still had legal force. 20 days to vacate remained its binding terms. But for the first time since the barbecue, she could envision a different ending. "If we do this," she said carefully, If we find a way forward, it has to be with the understanding that this is my home that I'm sharing with you, not our home that I happen to live in. That distinction matters. We understand, Jessica said quickly. I understand. I think I lost sight of that somewhere along the way, but I understand it now. Ellie studied their faces, seeing hope tempered with genuine recognition of the work ahead. Trust, once broken, required daily rebuilding. Respect, once lost, had to be re-earned through consistent action rather than promised through words. But perhaps Carmen Torres had been right about the possibility of bridges. We'll try, Ellie said finally. We'll take it one day at a time and see whether good intentions can become sustainable behavior. But the eviction notice stays in effect for now. If this experiment fails, if old patterns reassert themselves, you'll need to be prepared to find other housing. The conditional nature of their reconciliation created urgency without removing consequences. 20 days to prove that a family could learn from crisis, that love could be strengthened rather than destroyed by honest confrontation, that respect could be rebuilt on foundations strong enough to weather future storms. Outside the kitchen window, the neighborhood was waking up to another ordinary day. But inside the house on Dorchester Street, 3 adults were beginning the delicate work of rebuilding a family on terms that honored everyone's dignity, a process that would require more courage than the conflict that had brought them to this crossroads. 3 months later, Ellie stood in Margaret O'Sullivan's backyard again, watching her family interact with neighbors who had witnessed their very public crisis. The October air carried the crisp promise of autumn, and Maggie's final barbecue of the season buzzed with the comfortable energy of a community that had weathered another Boston summer together. The scene was familiar, yet fundamentally different from that devastating afternoon in August. Jessica moved through conversations with a quieter confidence, her interactions marked by genuine engagement rather than defensive performance. When Mrs. Flanagan complimented the potato salad Jessica had brought, she responded with a smile that reached her eyes. Thank you, but I have to credit Eleanor for teaching me the recipe. She's been showing me all of Patrick's favorites. The casual reference to Eleanor, rather than the possessive my mother-in-law, might have seemed insignificant to casual observers, but Ellie heard in it the respect that had been slowly, deliberately rebuilt over 13 weeks of careful attention to language, gesture, and daily consideration. Mickey stood near the grill with other neighborhood men, but his posture had changed. Where he had once seemed anxious about potential conflicts, he now carried himself with the confidence of someone who had learned to address problems directly rather than hoping they would resolve themselves. When Tom Chen mentioned household stress, Mickey spoke openly about the family meeting they held every month to address concerns before they escalated. Best thing we ever did, Mickey said, accepting a beer from his neighbor. Turns out avoiding difficult conversations just makes them more difficult. Sophia and Danny played with the same children they had always played with, but their laughter carried a lightness that had been absent during the tense months before the crisis. They moved between adults with the easy confidence of children, who understood their place in a stable family structure, no longer walking on eggshells around grown-up tensions they couldn't comprehend. Ellie watched her granddaughter demonstrate a card trick she had learned from Father Tom during one of their family check-ins, her small hands moving with careful precision as she explained each step to her captivated audience. The priest had become a regular presence in their lives, not as crisis counselor, but as family friend, someone who understood that healing required ongoing attention rather than single dramatic gestures. She's got your patience, Margaret observed, joining Ellie near the dessert table where the chocolate cake sat. The same recipe Ellie had brought to every neighborhood gathering for 15 years, now prepared with Jessica's assistance and presented with shared pride. She's got her grandmother's determination too, Ellie replied, noting how Sophia persisted through the complicated trick even when her audience grew restless. That child doesn't give up easily. None of the McCarthys do, from what I've observed, Margaret said with meaningful emphasis. Though I have to say, this family seems happier than I've seen them in years. Whatever you all worked out after. Well, after that day, it seems to be holding. The tactful reference to that day reflected the neighborhood's careful approach to the crisis that had become local legend. People remembered, but they also respected the family's efforts to rebuild. The eviction notice had been formally withdrawn after 6 weeks of demonstrated behavioral change, but its symbolic power remained, a reminder that respect was not optional, that love required tending, that families could fracture if taken for granted. Jessica approached with Carmen Torres, the two women having developed an unlikely friendship based on shared grandchildren and Carmen's ongoing role as informal family advisor. The older woman's presence at neighborhood gatherings had become natural, her practical wisdom and no-nonsense approach to family dynamics earning respect from Irish mothers who recognized kindred spirit regardless of cultural differences. Eleanor, Carmen said warmly, I was just telling Jessica about my nephew's wedding next month. Such a celebration when families find their way back to each other. The comment carried layers of meaning that all three women understood. Carmen had become expert at offering support disguised as casual conversation, her observations carrying weight precisely because they emerged from experience rather than sentiment. Jessica's been helping me plan the menu, Ellie said, including her daughter-in-law in the conversation with the natural ease that had gradually replaced their former wariness. She has wonderful ideas about presentation. It was a small thing, sharing credit for party planning, but it represented the kind of daily recognition that had rebuilt their relationship. Jessica's contributions were acknowledged rather than assumed, her efforts appreciated rather than expected. In return, Jessica had learned to ask rather than assert, to suggest rather than demand, to express gratitude through actions that made words unnecessary. The afternoon progressed with the comfortable rhythm of successful family gatherings. When Sophia scraped her knee during an enthusiastic game of tag, both Jessica and Ellie moved to help her, their coordinated response reflecting months of learning, to work together rather than compete for maternal authority. When Danny needed help with his plate at the buffet table, Mickey guided him through the process of asking his grandmother politely rather than simply assuming her assistance. Small moments, ordinary interactions, but they carried the weight of lessons learned through crisis. The family had developed new patterns built on explicit respect rather than assumed obligations, clear communication rather than avoided conflict, expressed gratitude rather than entitled assumption. As the sun began to set, signaling the end of Maggie's gathering, Ellie found herself standing in the same spot where she had served the eviction notice 3 months earlier. The memory carried no triumph now, only recognition of how close they had come to permanent fracture and gratitude for the wisdom that had guided them back from that brink. Jessica appeared beside her, carrying the empty cake plate with the careful attention she now paid to Ellie's belongings. "Ready to head home?" she asked, the word home carrying none of the possessive assumption that had once characterized her references to the brownstone. "In a moment," Ellie replied, watching her grandchildren say goodbye to their friends with the easy promises of children who knew they would see each other again soon. "I was just thinking about how much can change in a few months." "Everything," Jessica said softly. "Everything and nothing, really. We're still the same people, but we're better versions of ourselves, I think." Mickey joined them, their family unit naturally reforming as the gathering wound down. He carried Danny on his shoulders while Sophia skipped beside them, both children tired but happy from an afternoon of play and community celebration. "Good party," Mickey observed as they walked toward the gate. "Though I have to say, I prefer the ones where nobody gets evicted." His joke carried enough time and healing to be genuinely funny rather than painful. They all laughed, real laughter, that acknowledged the shared trauma they had survived and transformed into stronger family bonds. The walk home stretched 3 blocks that now felt comfortable rather than tense. They moved as a family unit that had learned to function with explicit respect rather than assumed hierarchy, with expressed gratitude rather than entitled expectations, with ongoing attention to each other's needs rather than defensive protection of individual territories. At the front door of the brownstone, Ellie paused with her keys in her hand, looking up at the house that had sheltered 3 generations of McCarthys through depression and prosperity, war and peace, births and deaths, and all the ordinary dramas that comprised family life. "Thank you," Jessica said quietly, understanding the moment's significance. "For not giving up on us, for showing us how to be better." "Thank you," Ellie replied, "for proving that families can learn, that people can change, that love is strong enough to survive honest confrontation." They entered the house together, not as landlord and tenants, not as martyred benefactor and grateful recipients, but as family members who had fought their way through crisis to discover that respect and love could coexist, that boundaries and belonging could strengthen rather than threaten each other, that the hardest conversations often led to the strongest relationships. In the kitchen, Jessica automatically began preparations for Sunday dinner, while Ellie helped the children with homework at the table where they had held their first difficult family meeting months earlier. Mickey reviewed bills and household responsibilities, his participation in domestic management now active rather than passive. The evening unfolded with the comfortable efficiency of people who had learned to work together rather than around each other. When conflicts arose, and they still did, because humans remained imperfect even after crisis-induced growth, they were addressed directly, honestly, with the understanding that problems solved early remained manageable while problems avoided grew toxic. As Ellie prepared for bed that night, she looked at Patrick's photograph on her dresser, the frame flanked now by pictures of Jessica's graduation from her new position and Sophia's latest art project. The bedroom remained hers. Private. Space in a house that functioned as shared family territory governed by explicit respect rather than assumed deference. "We made it through," she whispered to Patrick's familiar smile. "All of us. Scarred but stronger, chastened but closer. The children will remember that families can survive hard times if everyone is willing to do the work." Outside her window, the neighborhood settled into Sunday evening quiet. Porch lights coming on in houses where other families navigated their own complex relationships with varying degrees of success. But inside the brownstone on Dorchester Street, 3 adults and 2 children had discovered that love tested by crisis could emerge more durable than love that had never been challenged. The eviction notice lay in Ellie's desk drawer now, not destroyed but preserved as a reminder of how quickly families could fracture and how much work was required to rebuild trust once broken. It served as insurance against complacency, evidence that respect was not optional, proof that even the deepest love required daily tending to thrive. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, ordinary irritations, the ongoing work of people learning to live together with intention rather than assumption. But they would face those challenges as a family that had been tested and had chosen each other, not from obligation or desperation, but from the harder commitment to build relationships strong enough to weather the storms that test all families, willing to love each other truly. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.